Way of X number 2 was another fantastic issue, quickly making this a heated three-way race for X book I'm most excited to read week to week between Way of X, Sword, and X-Men when Hickman's bringing the heat. The series' second issue is fast-paced, massively tied to huge questions of the Krakoa era of X-Men, and even manages to slip in quietly great character moments throughout. Today I'll answer, what has Orchis been doing with Legion? What is Krakoa's greatest internal threat? What does that issue ending mean? One of the best last page reveals we've seen in the entire reign of X, and probably in the entire Krakoa era of X-Men, since House of X and Powers ended. I'm Dave Busing, founder and editor-in-chief of comicbookherald.com. You are listening to Krakin Krakoa number 182, where I'm going to talk Way of X number 2 in detail, including spoilers for what follows, and some theories for what's to come. If you like the Comic Book Herald YouTube channel, please consider liking, subscribing, sharing, and commenting here. It all helps me out a great deal, and definitely I want to know what you thought about this issue and your theories for what comes next. Writer Cy Spurrier, artist Bob Quinn, colors Javier Tartaglia, letters by Clayton Cowles. So Legion here hops into Nightcrawler's mindscape and uncovers something secret lingering in Nightcrawler's subconscious. And the implication here is that these types of mental implants are what's causing some of the rot that we have seen in Krakoa and in the way that mutant kind is acting. Now, Legion here, he finds this and then he references, that he's basically going to explode. He says, I don't want to tear reality in half. This is, as far as the character's history goes, definitely reference back to the likes of Age of Apocalypse, which was more or less caused by Legion, Age of X during the Mike Carey run on X-Men, or of course you could reference back to Cy Spurrier's run on X-Men Legacy, which focused heavily on Legion and the implications of what this character can do. But if you're unfamiliar with Legion, as a character, and Way of X obviously is digging in deeply, this is a character who is the son of Professor X and has Omega-level immense abilities. So yes, he can do something like that. Like when he says tear reality in half, it's not a joke. We learn here that Legion appearing as an astral projection is actually all he can do because he's without a body and his brain is trapped in an Orchis facility. Throughout the issue, there remains a fair amount of mystery how Legion got in this state because the last we've seen of the character in Marvel before this series was back in Age of X-Men when Legion was suited up before the Hickman era began. So we don't actually see how Orchis captures him, and Legion here doesn't quite remember exactly what happened, but we know that they have him and they've been experimenting on him, which explains why we haven't seen David Haller and why this character has been, totally hidden from even the likes of Mr. Sinister, who's been looking to collect his DNA throughout the entire Hickman era of X-Men. We do get an Orchis data page, obscurely discussing the acquisition of Legion's brain. It doesn't give us too much information other than kind of talking about why and what they were doing with this asset as they consider it. Now, the Orchis experiment basically took David out as a controlling presence. So when David Haller is in control of the legion of, powers and personalities essentially in his brain, he can kind of mitigate their presence and they're just running rampant. But they took him out of that. They introduced something else, which they've redacted here, and then they watched, the decay accelerate exponentially. So they're using Legion's brain as what they call a modeling resource for Krakoan mutant society. It's kind of running these experiments on basically what happens when you just have, infinite powers living forever, basically without any kind of control. Like, basically, and what, it seems like Orchis is trying to figure out here is how can we get Krakoa to destabilize itself, essentially, right? Because Orchis, again, is this combination. It's a combination of all of these human agencies essentially that are looking to protect humanity's interests. And then we get a reference here too to the Orchis petals, the various layers and sort of pieces of the organization that we really haven't seen fleshed out much since Orchis was introduced in the Hickman written House and Powers issues. We've now seen some of these petals explained here in Way of X and in Sword, and I've been enjoying seeing their organization play out a little more specifically and a little more clearly. Now, as Nightcrawler and Pixie are battling in Legion's mindscape and Dr. Nemesis checks in from the outside, Legion talks about his final memories before capture, which again are very fuzzy. He doesn't quite remember the details, but he does remember that he heard Ruth, aka Blindfold's voice, aka a precog, not allowed on Krakoa. We have not seen Blindfold resurrected, and the expectation is that we will not, but she told Legion, one word basically, and it was inevitable. And there's some definite intrigue what Blindfold means by that. The last we saw of Ruth was in the pre-Hickman era in Uncanny X-Men, written by Matthew Rosenberg. The character actually commits suicide in the very early parts of that run, and there's been a lot of speculation, and theorizing, myself included, that some of this was anticipated that basically, there would be no home for her on Krakoa, but the addition now of this inevitable line, I think, is very interesting as well. Now, we get further explanation from Dr. Nemesis and from the gang talking about, okay, what is the experiment going on in Legion's brain? Again, they're looking at infinite expansion of societies with no limits. As Spurrier puts it here, when everything's possible, but nothing matters. So again, kind of a look at a possible future for Krakoa left totally, unimpeded, potentially. Legion interprets this as what Ruth meant by inevitable. Sort of this idea of they are inevitably going to be driven to this state of really madness as the years, go on, and they never quite, things don't change or whatever. But I kind of saw it instead as inevitable, potentially referencing that famous line that Moira McTaggart has in House and Powers, which is, "We always lose." Is mutant kind losing? Is them never winning? Is that the inevitability that Ruth is actually referring to? I think it's going to be very interesting as Legion becomes a bigger piece of Way of X and now is like, he's out there, he's well known, everybody knows Legion's around. What's going to happen with Blindfold? And why is that conversation not really happened to this point? Because we have here, for example, Pixie, who says to Legion, like, hey, Ruth was one of my closest friends. If that's true, why aren't more people talking about her resurrection? I think that remains an interesting question. Now, to get out of the predicament of Legion's mindscape run amok, it comes down to Kirk to kill, in quotes, Legion's brain, essentially here, and to queue him up instead for Krakoan resurrection, and that is the favor for a favor that Legion has requested of Nightcrawler in this issue. The assumption others make here is that not only is Kurt not usually a killer, but that such an act severely violates his religious creeds, and it's a huge moment here that Kurt begins to ask forgiveness of his god and then stops himself. He just doesn't bother. He's like, what's the point, essentially? This is big for Kurt, especially, and pun intended, in the execution of the deed. And we see as we get into, Nightcrawler's sacred text, essentially, as he's writing the first Florilegium of this newfound, Way of X, he is acknowledging here that this is part of the path of the Way of X, is, it not outright atheism necessarily, not saying forsaking the Christianity or the Roman Catholicism that Nightcrawler definitely followed in the past, but basically saying like, no, this is new, this is something else entirely, and like this is the way, this is me finding the purpose and the path for mutant kind. And it is a big change. I put up a video earlier this morning in anticipation of this issue about the religious history of Nightcrawler, and if you watch that video, you'll see that Nightcrawler's literally a priest in the early 2000s. Like, this is a central tenet of this character, and this is a big break. So this will be an interesting thread to follow for fans of Kurt Wagner as a character, specifically Kurt Wagner, I should say. Now, the death and resurrection of Legion is fascinating in and of itself. Okay, so Nightcrawler does the deed. Legion's going to be resurrected, but this is no small thing. It's this huge moment on Krakoa, bringing basically everyone to bear witness, including bringing Zorn and Zorn out of hibernation. Haven't seen them in a hot minute. I was thinking here potentially that like part of this could be that maybe we hadn't seen too many Omega level mutants resurrected yet, but that's not true, because as I look back on it, like, we've seen Jamie Braddock resurrected, and Quentin Quire has literally made a career out of it, to the point that he's making specifications for all sorts of body parts. So like, yeah, we've seen Omega levels resurrected before, but not like Legion. Legion's a big one, and he's got a history, and it gets a whole lot of attention. Quick call out here, Professor X is the worst dad in the world. This should not come as a surprise, but it bears repeating that the father of Krakoa, the mutant mankind places its hopes and dreams on, is the absolute worst father to his own child. As we look at the internal threats of Krakoa, which Way of X is doing, this is relevant at the very least metaphorically. And the way Legion points out here that, Legion presents as a threat to Professor X, particularly a threat to the big party Charlie wants to throw at the Hellfire Gala, it's infuriating. It's really upsetting. And Professor X, he's doing the whole, oh, I'm so torn up. If only I could reinstall the consciousness of Legion, who was placed into this husk, which, good grief, why was he even put into a husk of his body if you weren't going to put his consciousness back inside him? Like, why did we go through those steps? That's wild. It's just like, oh, Professor X, you are the absolute worst. Kitty Pryde, Was right. You know, it's funny. I just finished rereading the Muir Island Saga for our My Marvelous Year podcast and reading club, and in the aftermath, Professor X immediately jumps into trying to save David, at great risk to himself after the Shadow King leaves David catatonic. You know, and it's such, you know, it's 30 years later reading these comics, it's such a difference in how Professor X, like, knowing he's a failed father, but still desperately wants to help, and kind of where we are now with Professor X, and just being like, my priorities are so wholly Krakoa, so wholly pragmatically related to the nation state that I'm not even going to put the consciousness of my son back in his resurrected husk. That's a big change. And even in like the Muir Island Saga, like Professor X fails. Like he is constantly failing David, regardless of his intentions. But those intentions, to me, do make a pretty big difference. Now, the real shocker here is that Legion just up and uploads his own consciousness, which I cannot even begin to explain, other than to just sort of wave my hands and say Omega level, I guess. It's a pretty cool moment nonetheless, and Legion showing up to make fun of his dad's astronaut helmet, it kind of rules. Legion makes it abundantly clear he wants nothing to do with Krakoa's Quiet Council or their big plans, including Magneto trying to immediately pitch him on his Omega-level mutant plans that are clearly coming in planet-size X-Men during the Hellfire Gala. I really like Legion as the outsider mutant, right? The Omega-level outsider who's just like, I'm not playing these games. I'm not interested in your Krakoa. I'm interested in different things. I'm interested in getting to the truth of all of this, uncovering some of these secrets and shadows. Legion does form a connection with Kurt here because Kurt is actually questioning what's happening, and Legion trusts that. You know, the character with the most doubt is actually the character that seems the most trustworthy to Legion, and I have to say, the more I read of this, the more I agree. Now, the huge ending reveal here as Legion and Kurt talk is the Patchwork Man is not Legion or one of his personalities run amok, this Patchwork Man who has been invisibly and sort of, navigating Krakoa and haunting children's dreams and apparently lost. This new character can see them, but seemingly no one else. And again, like, this is according to Legion, so he could be lying here. But instead, he's saying that this is another of Professor X's heirs, as David calls him, Onslaught. This is big, right? This is huge. Up front, I also really like the framing of Onslaught as effectively the heir of Professor X and Magneto, almost a mutant technology combination made sentient. But again, this is a big character reveal that we've been waiting for since House and Powers, at least that I've been waiting for. And of course, if you know your X-Men history at all, the Onslaught saga in the 90s is one of the most memorable, definitely not one of the best, but definitely left a very lasting impression on X-Men comics and X-Men history. Now, Onslaught is the intensely 90s psionic combination of Professor X and Magneto, resulting from Professor X shutting down Magneto's brain after the Fatal Attractions crossover, or if we're being honest, that time they literally mind-cuddled. Onslaught is so absurdly powerful, he wasted the Juggernaut, was in total control of taking down the X-Men, wiped out the Avengers and Fantastic Four from Earth 616, setting up the Heroes Reborn, the original version, and put Marvel into bankruptcy. I've theorized since Powers of 10 that Moira McTaggart, Moira X, was more aware of her role in creating Onslaught than we would have previously known. I believe this still, right? I think that her pushing Professor X to accept her path forward, you know, her plans for mutant kind, as opposed to the dream that Professor X has always clung to, I think there's an indication in this journal entry number 14, which again, I believe we see in Powers of 10 number 6, that she fractured his psyche in doing this, or it definitely had a role in fracturing his psyche to the point that it made it, you know, in getting her way, in a way, in getting him over to her side, setting the stage for unleashing Onslaught, which I think is an interesting thread to look back on Moira's influence, knowing what we know now. Now, an unexpected, untracked reemergence of Onslaught in the Krakoa era is yet another huge sign that Professor X and the mutant leaders are not anywhere near as in control as the Reign of X would have you believe. And remember, although Moira's planning and knowledge through lifelines gives mutants an advantage, this is, to our knowledge, the only life where she and Professor X intentionally created children of their own as Omega-level mutants with Proteus and Legion. I don't know that the same is definitely true of Onslaught, but it very easily could be, which means there's no lifeline learning here. There's no escape hatch for how to deal with the reemergence and the presence of Onslaught. It's uncharted territory, and that's very exciting. You know, I like the idea of Moira and Professor X sort of having this ultimate plan because of what Moira's been through, but I also like the idea of these very powerful outside things like Legion, or characters like Legion, like an Onslaught, like a Proteus, having, unexpected ramifications, because these are characters who did not exist in Moira's previous lifelines. So, okay, given all that, what do we do with Onslaught or the Patchwork Man in the Krakoa era of X-Men? Well, one idea is that Onslaught is somehow what Orchis managed to weaponize and drop into Krakoa to destabilize their nation, to escalate their descent a la the Legion models we saw earlier, right? So you drop the Onslaught psionic entity in, this Patchwork Man begins sort of putting these bugs essentially in the subconscious of mutant kind, and it makes them reckless. It sets them on a path towards infinite destruction, as we saw in the Legion mindscape. Or the idea I like the most, regardless of how Onslaught wound up on the island, is based on a tenet of House and Powers, and that's breaking all the rules. If the assumption is that Onslaught is this psionic entity that threatens all of mutant kind, then the new era twist is for mutants to find a way to work with Onslaught. It pays here to think too about what Onslaught actually wanted to do in the 90s Onslaught saga. As a combination of a beaten down and weary Professor X and Mags, Onslaught's original mission is the ascendance of the Homo superior race. He's very early 90s X-Men #1, Jim Lee, Chris Claremont, Magneto in that regard, right? Honestly, that pretty much aligns too with where mutant kind's at in the reign of X, they're significantly less brutalizing and murdering of humankind. Obviously, it's one of the laws, kill no man or murder no man, whatever the actual language is. So you take that out of the equation, though, and a Professor X and most of mutant kind, they are more or less on board with what Onslaught wants. So given that fact, could this, and again, I don't know if we treat Onslaught as I said, like a psionic entity, as a mutant. I'm a little unclear. I'm also a little unclear, like with the Shadow King, who we see playing in the pages of New Mutants by Vidal and Rodriguez, which is one of my other favorite books right now. Like, are these entities outside of resurrection protocols? I would think they would be, but regardless, they're very heavily tied to mutants over the years. What influence are both of them? Now they're both on Krakoa, and they're both sort of having an influence on, and not only just like mutants, but on like the children, on the mutants of growing up of Krakoa. Like, this is a huge deal, talking about the internal threats, and again, sort of the rot at the heart of Krakoa, and it's up to Nightcrawler and Legion to figure out sort of what to do next. So again, like Way of X, it's at the top of my favorite X books. I'm loving every issue. I'm so excited about where this series is going. There's such quietly good moments here too, for Loa, Dr. Nemesis, Dazzler, and even Fabian Cortez, fresh off his sword firing. So Way of X is an absolute must-read. Highly recommended. Again, the next issue is going to be part of the Hellfire Gala, which is coming in June, which is where everything is heading. So let me know. What do you think? What are your theories? What are your comments? Where do you think all of this is going, particularly the Onslaught of it all, the Legion as an Omega level mutant? What is that? Rot in the subconscious. Is that Professor X theory related, right? Because there's the idea that it's implanted by Orchis, but then there's also what a lot of people have been desperately wanting to come true since House and Powers, which is that I think Moira and Professor X are doing something to mutants to make them go along with this all. Could that be what we're seeing here as well? Definitely let me know your thoughts here in the comments. Thanks so much, everybody, for listening. Again, I'm Dave. You can find ways to support my work over at patreon.com/comicbookherald. Thanks so much to those of you who do. Thank you, Jesse W., Megan Getman, Cole Weathers, Martin Lopez, Chris Isidro, Brent Bowser, Professor X3769, Richard Renz, Verisimilitude, Terra Nort, Ed Mackey, Clyde DeGlide, Pinball Drew, Mike Solomons, Matt Mahoney, and John Samander for all of your support. Thanks, everybody. You can find my stuff over at comicbookherald.com, at comicbookherald on social. Look for the best comics ever in my marvelous year podcast for more from me. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and as always, enjoy the comics.